A lot of times I find that when people arrive on Palm Sunday, the beginning of Holy Week, they are feeling kind of down on themselves. And not necessarily for the reasons you might expect, right? And so, not necessarily because they feel bad for their sins or because they have a greater awareness of their need for conversion, but specifically because they haven't kept up their Lenten promises. And so, let's say, for example, I decided to give up chips for Lent, but then the other day I had a bag of Doritos. Or let's say I decided to give up chocolate for Lent, but then the other day I had a Snickers bar, that kind of thing. Now, certainly there's something to be said about trying our best, to maintain this habit of prayer, fasting, and almsgiving over the course of the 40 days of Lent. Hopefully that goes without saying. But at the same time, when people feel bad simply because they haven't kept up their Lenten promises, quite honestly, it makes me think, are people really aware of issues of context, intention, and purpose? And specifically, are people really aware of the fact that the whole point of Lent is not so much to maintain kind of preconceived notions of, habits and structures and routines, but instead to collaborate with God's grace, to actually become more conformed to the person of Christ. In other words, throughout the season of Lent, we need to actively resist the temptation to become so fixated on our preconceived habits and structures and routines that we start to believe that these are the things that are meant to make us holy, as opposed to simply God himself. Father Timothy Gallagher speaks about this particular point indirectly when he uses the analogy of an apartment building. And so basically what he says is that if you're looking for a friend in the context of an apartment building, maybe one day you find your friend right away, right? So first room you check, first floor that you check. But maybe the second day it takes a while, right? So maybe you find him eventually on the 5th floor, east wing, wherever the case may be. But the whole idea is that once you find your friend, you stop. Because the whole point of the exercise is not to search the entire building. The whole point of the exercise is to find your friend and enjoy your friend's company. And of course, the whole point is that so it goes when it comes to the spiritual life. And so, for example, when it comes to the subject of prayer, there are basically 3 types: vocal prayer, meditative prayer, and contemplative prayer. And so vocal prayers are basically set prayers, prayers like the Our Father, the Hail Mary, prayer cards, that kind of thing. Meditative prayer involves a more active engagement of the intellectual and imaginative faculties. And so, for example, think about when you're praying with the various mysteries in the gospel in the context of the rosary. Or think about the common practice of Lectio Divina, where you're slowly unpacking the scriptures in a really prayerful and thoughtful sort of way. And then, of course, there's contemplative prayer, which doesn't so much engage the intellect or the imagination, but simply focuses on abiding with the Lord in a really still and quiet sort of way. In any case, mindful of these 3 different types of prayer, the question often arises, when I'm actually praying, how much of each type of prayer should I do? How much should I do in terms of vocal prayer, meditative prayer, and or contemplative prayer? And the answer is, it depends. And in particular, it depends on what God is actually calling you to do in the moment. And so, for example, let's say you're doing a holy hour, right? So 60 minutes before the Lord in the Blessed Sacrament. And let's say you begin with a game plan, as you should, right? And so you begin with the idea that I might begin and end with vocal prayer, an Our Father, a Hail Mary, whatever the case may be. Maybe on top of that, you decide to spend the first half of your holy hour on meditative prayer. And then finally, maybe you spend the final half hour of your holy hour on contemplative prayer. Again, simply focusing on abiding the Lord in a quiet and silent sort of way. Now, obviously, again, that's a really good and noble plan, made with an abundance of good intentions. But the point still remains that in the context of your actual prayer before the Lord in the Blessed Sacrament, if the Lord inspires you to do more of one type of prayer versus the other, well, then you go with that. Because again, the whole point of the exercise is not so much to kind of hit your preconceived spiritual targets. The whole point of the exercise is to respond to the Lord, to respond to his grace, which is calling you in the moment to more fully abide in him by doing this as opposed to that. If you're not attentive to that particular dynamic, then in a certain sense, what are you doing? You're simply saying prayers as opposed to actually praying before the Lord with a real spirit of humility, obedience, and docility. But you see, hold that thought now and think about the season of Lent. And so as you all know, the season of Lent begins with us picking certain things to do with regards to the categories of prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. But then, of course, as we also know, as the 40 days progress, what happens? Life happens. Interruptions happen. Stresses increase. As a result of which it becomes really difficult to maintain any sort of schedule, spiritual or otherwise, which in turn begs the question, what are we supposed to do in that particular situation? Well, the answer again is it depends. It depends. And so maybe the Lord is calling you to persevere in terms of your prior resolutions. So we can't discount that. Maybe he's calling you to do less, to do the same thing, but maybe not so much. Mindful of the fact that maybe you weren't as strong as you thought you were at the very beginning of Lent. Or maybe, just maybe, in light of a recurring difficulty to maintain a particular penitential practice, maybe the Lord is simply inviting you to abandon that thing altogether. In any case, there's obviously all sorts of different ways that one might respond to that particular issue. But hopefully you see that the common denominator is to respond to God's grace, to do whatever the Lord is calling you to do or modify or let go to become more conformed to the person of Christ, as opposed to simply trying to maintain these arbitrarily decided upon habits, routines, and structures. To illustrate the point, I want to share with you an example from my own life, actually, which actually took place during this current season of Lent. And so, as you probably know, over the context of this current season of Lent, I've done a whole bunch of different talks and missions in a whole variety of circumstances and settings, including a Lenten mission at St. Paul's in Alliston, Ontario. And the particular focus when it came to that Lenten mission was the Gospel of Matthew chapter 13, which focuses specifically on various parables dealing with the kingdom of heaven, including the parable of the weeds and the wheat. And so, as you might recall, in the context of that particular story, the workers in a particular field, they suddenly discover that there's weeds which have arisen in the midst of this field of wheat. As a result of which they run to the master and they offer to uproot the weeds, which again have arisen in the midst of the wheat. In response to which the master says no. And specifically in the gospel, what it says, just to kind of paraphrase, is that the reason why we're called to not uproot the weeds prematurely is because it might do damage to the weeds, right? So it speaks to the fact that the reason why God permits any sort of evil or wickedness to exist in the world is to bring about a greater good, right? So you need to let these things play out until the end of time. But you see, on top of that, in the context of this particular Lenten mission, I made the additional point in real time that another reason why the master doesn't want the weeds to be uprooted prematurely is because he has deep trust. And specifically, he has deep trust that the power of the wheat to grow and flourish is stronger than the power of the weeds to corrupt and destroy. But you see, here's the thing. When I made that particular point, again, about the power of the wheat to grow and flourish versus the power of the weeds to corrupt and destroy, I started to choke up with emotion. And I didn't plan to. It just kind of happened, right? And perhaps it took the people by surprise, but it certainly took me by surprise. I certainly didn't plan or expect to cry in that particular moment, but there it was. And obviously that particular moment, especially with this emotional resonance, really kind of taught me something about myself, which I hadn't really been aware of ahead of time. And so, for example, if someone had come up to me before the beginning of that particular Lenten mission and asked me, like, look, Father, do you believe that the power of the Holy Spirit to help you grow and flourish is in fact stronger than the power of the devil to corrupt and destroy? I would have said, well, obviously I believe that because I'm Catholic and I'm a Catholic priest on top of that. But in retrospect, perhaps not. Or perhaps more accurately, just to kind of quote the centurion in the gospel, this particular issue probably fell in the category of like, Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief. And but you see, here's the point. This is kind of the reason I bring this up. In light of this particular revelation from the Lord to me in space and time about this tender place in my heart, I didn't just plow ahead with regards to my preconceived notions of prayer, fasting, and almsgiving, but instead I decided to tailor these things, these penitential practices, to this particular area of growth which the Lord had revealed to me in the context of, again, this particular circumstance. And so moving forward, I decided to actively fast from negative thoughts, giving undue credence to the power of the devil working in my life. I decided to feast in the context of prayer on the truth about the power of the Holy Spirit struggling to emerge victorious in my heart. And on top of that, I tried to be really intentional about moving forward and trying to live actively from this new space of truth and freedom. And so in all these things, you see the prayer and the fasting and the almsgiving, right? But done with intention, done with purpose, done with a certain mindfulness to context and in collaboration with God's grace of conversion, which is always discovered and anticipated as opposed to manufactured. Okay, one final example, and I'll kind of end with this. And so I remember back in the day when I was still at St. Augustine Seminary, starting to be a priest, talking to a fellow seminarian who was in turn talking about his own aunt who was dying. And so basically, as he tells the story, my friend was praying for the longest time that his aunt might be healed, his aunt who had been sick for a really long time. And so a really good and noble prayer to pray for the healing of our loved ones. But then as time progressed and he kind of prayed into the matter, he realized that the Lord was telling him that basically his aunt's time had come, as a result of which he changed his prayer. And so from that point on, instead of focusing on healing and restoration, he started praying for acceptance. He started praying for comfort. He started praying for consolation. Lord, give me and my family the grace and the courage and the strength to accept this difficult thing, the impending loss of someone that we love really dearly. And on top of that, give this person comfort and consolation as she enters into her final days and her final moments. And might suggest, friends, that's a really good example of a mature way to pray and to relate to God in general. to defer always to his will as opposed to insisting that my will be done. But hopefully on top of that, you can see through this particular example that the stuff we're talking about today doesn't simply apply to the season of Lent, but is meant actually to carry forward with us throughout the course of our lives. And in particular, we're called to remember and to reflect deeply on the fact that holiness is never our project. Holiness is never something that we simply produce through our collective prayer and fasting and almsgiving, but instead it is always God's project. We should always be able to look back on our lives and say, like, look, the Lord is the one who made us into the person that God was always calling us to be, as opposed to, this is something that I did through my own efforts and ingenuity. And what this means, practically speaking, is that when you go forth and you live your life, certainly try your best to engage your mind and your intellect to make good and noble plans, some variation of the prayer and the fasting and the almsgiving. But at the same time, don't be surprised and don't be scandalized when sometimes these plans are frustrated, when these plans are sometimes even brought to ruin. Because the point still remains, all things work together for the good for those who love the Lord. And the Lord is using even these frustrated plans to bring about his salvific designs. And may God bless you all.